Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Yitro, perhaps one of the most well-known Torah portions in our annual cycle. Parashat Yitro includes the Ten Commandments. More correctly, Parashat Yitro presents the dramatic story of God's revelation at Mount Sinai, of which the Ten Commandments are part. The Hebrew phrase Har Sinai literally means Mount Sinai, the location where this event took place. But the rabbis also used the phrase Har Sinai, and sometimes just the name Sinai itself, to refer to the event itself. Exodus chapter 19 presents the events before the giving of the commandments, and chapter 20 presents the actual event, the moment of Har Sinai. Chapter 19 tells us that the Israelites have arrived at the wilderness of Sinai, according to Jewish tradition, 7 weeks after leaving Egypt. This chapter presents God's general admonition to be faithful to the Brit, to the covenant, to obey God's commandments, and in so doing, to fulfill the challenge to be a Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, the Goy Kadosh, and a holy nation. This chapter includes instructions for 3 days of preparation for the revelation that's going to take place. Chapter 19 also describes thunder and lightning and a dense cloud surrounding the mountain, apparent earthquakes, fire, and smoke. And chapter 19 also includes a pledge from the Israelites, and this is before the commandments are given. The Israelites promise, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh. All that Adonai says, we will do. And then chapter 20, the actual Aseret HaDibrot, usually translated in English as the Ten Commandments. After we read of the Ten Commandments, we read also in chapter 20 that the Israelites are terrified. And so they say to Moses, Daber ata imanu v'nishma'a, you speak to us and we will obey. Ve'al yidaber imanu Elohim pen namut, but let not God speak to us, lest we die. In the ancient world, there was a belief that getting too close to the gods might result in death. And that belief is reflected here as the Israelites are afraid that even hearing God communicate with them any more than they already have will result in their deaths. And so Moses stays up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the rest of the commandments from God, which he will subsequently convey to the Israelites. Now, while Moses is up on the mountain, the Israelites end up committing the sin of building and worshiping the golden calf. But that's a different story entirely, since it happens many chapters later. The pshat, the simple, literal meaning of chapters 19 and 20 are dramatic enough. But as I've done with previous Torah portions, I'd like to explore this dramatic story with you through the lens of Midrash, of rabbinic legends, which add numerous additional details, interpretations, and levels of meaning to the biblical text. So let's explore a few rabbinic midrashim and see where they take us. I've entitled this first midrash, Offering the Torah to Israel, because as you will see, according to this legend, the Israelites were not the first nation to whom God offered the commandments. The midrash begins here on line 1. Nigla al bnei Esav harasha ve'amar lahem mikablim atem aleichem et haTorah. God revealed God's self to the children of the wicked Esau and said to them, will you accept upon yourselves the Torah? Now, the descendants of Esau are not Israelites. Esau was Jacob's twin brother, whom the rabbis see as an evil person, totally unworthy of inheriting the covenant. And so Jacob inherits the covenant from Abraham, his grandfather, and from Isaac, his father, and passes it on to his descendants, known as Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. But before offering the Torah to the children of Israel, God offered it to their distant cousins, the descendants of Esau. Line 2, Amrulo ma kativ ba. In response to God's question, will you accept upon yourselves the Torah? Esau's descendants asked God, well, what's written in it? Can you give us an example of some of the commandments? Line 3, Amar lahem lo tirtzach. So God said to them, well, for example, you shall not murder. Line 4, Amru lo, Zohi Yerusha Shehorishenu Avinu. They said to God, this is the inheritance which our father was bequeathed. Shene'emar ve'al charbacha tichyeh. As it says in Genesis 27, by your sword you shall live. So Esau's descendants weren't particularly interested in accepting commandments that included the prohibition of murder, because evidently murder is part of their national tradition. Line 6, Nigla al bnei Ammon uMoav. Then God revealed God's self to the children of Ammon and Moab, two other non-Israelite groups. Amar lahem mikablim atem et haTorah. God said to them, will you accept the Torah? Line 8, Amru lo ma katuv ba. They too said to God, what is written in it? Amar lahem lo tin'af. God said to them, you shall not commit adultery. Line 10, Amru lo kulanu mini'uf. They said to God, our origin is in adultery. Dichtiv v'taharena shtei v'not lot me'avihen v'heach nekabbalah. As it is written in Genesis 19, thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. These people descend from the daughters of Lot, both of whom became pregnant by their father. In other words, the people of Ammon and Moab descend from adulterous relationships. Line 12, Nigla al bnei Yishmael. God revealed God's self to the descendants of Ishmael. Remember that Ishmael was Isaac's half-brother, Abraham's first son chronologically, that is. The descendants of Ishmael, distant cousins of the Israelites, are of course not Israelites themselves. So according to this legend, God turned to the children of Ishmael, and in line 13, Amar lahem mikablim atem aleichem et haTorah. God asks them, will you accept upon yourselves the Torah? Amru lo ma katuv ba. They too said to God, what is written in it? Amar lahem lo tignov. And God said to them, you shall not steal. Amru lo bezo habaracha nitbarech avinu. They said to God, with this blessing our father was blessed. Dichtiv v'hu yihyeh pera adam. As it says in Genesis 16, and he shall be a wild ass of a man. Dichtiv ki gunov gunavti. And it is also said in Genesis 40, for I was stolen. So the descendants of Ishmael also turned down the commandments, which include the prohibition of stealing, because stealing is part of their heritage. Line 19. Uchshaba etza Yisrael mimino eshdat lamo. When God came to Israel, lightning flashing at them from God's right, patchu kulam pihem ve'amru. They said together in unison, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. All that God says, we will do and we will listen. Now, I already quoted the promise that the Israelites made in chapter 19, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh. All that God says we will obey. And here in chapter 24, the Israelites reiterate that promise, expanding slightly upon it, promising Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. All that God says we will do and we will really listen to. So what does this midrash teach us? It's not an insult to the Israelites for us to be told you were not the first nation that I offered the Torah to. Rather, it's a distinction for the Israelites. All the other nations, when they were offered the Torah, wanted a little taste. They wanted a for instance. They wanted to know, what are these commandments of God all about? And in each of the previous cases, when God gave them an example of the commandments, they said, oh no, these commandments are not for us. The Israelites, in contrast, didn't begin by saying, well, we might accept the commandments, but give us a few examples. Tell us what the commandments are like. Without asking that, without hemming and hawing, without any sort of hedging, the Israelites say unabashedly, all that God says, we will do. All that God says, we will obey. The first Midrash talked about which nation might accept the mitzvot. This Midrash, text number 2, tells us that it's not only the Israelites who need the commandments. Amar Chizkiah. Chizkiah said, "My dichtiv mishamayim hishmata din eretz yara'a v'shakata." What is meant by that description in Psalm 79? In heaven you pronounced sentence, the earth feared and was tranquil. The earth feared. This passage in Psalms is not talking about these people or those people being afraid. It's talking about the earth being afraid. And so the Talmud asks, Im yara'ah lama shakata. If it feared, why was it tranquil? The im shakata lama yara'ah. And if it was tranquil, why did it fear? The answer is in line 5. Ela batechila yara'ah ulvasof shakta. The answer is, at first it feared, and subsequently it was tranquil. But that answer really begs the question. And so the Gemara goes on, and so the Talmud goes on, the lama yara'ah. And why did it fear? Why was the earth fearful? Line 7, Kideresh Lakish. As Reish Lakish explains, Milamed shehitna hakadosh baruch hu im ma'aseh v'reshit ve'amar lahem. This teaches that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, stipulated with the works of creation and said to it. What in this context are ma'aseh v'reshit, the works of creation? The world. And so God says to the world, here in line 9, Im Yisrael mekablim haTorah atem mitkayemin. If Israel accepts the Torah, you shall exist. The im lav ani machazir etchem l'tohu vavohu. But if not, I will turn you back into an unformed void. I will return you, O world that I have created, to tohu vavohu, to the primordial chaos from which the world had been created. And so it's not only the Israelites who need the Torah, the world needs the Torah. The existence of the world is predicated upon Torah. The world needs Torah to exist. Torah is built into the fabric of the cosmos. That was part of God's plan when God created the universe. And so now, if Torah is not accepted by one nation or another, in this case the Israelites, the survival of the world is possibly imperiled. Text number 3 is one of my favorite midrashim. And before we jump into this midrash, I want to remind you of something that I say so often that it's a cliche. You don't have to take midrash literally in order to take it seriously. And so I advise you, as I have before, not to get bogged down in the literal details or in the question of, is this literally true? Did it really happen? That's not the point of midrash. The point of midrash is where these legends take us and what these legends teach us. So now text number 3, which begins by explaining the phrase at the beginning of chapter 20, Vaidaber Elohim et kol hadavarim ha'ele lemor. And God spoke all of these words, saying. Now notice the title that I gave to text number 3, who stood at Sinai? The simple answer to the question, of course, is the Israelites. The Israelites who had come out of Egypt with Moses were at Mount Sinai with Moses. Rabbi Yitzchak has something else in mind. Line 2, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Ma shehanaviim atidim lehit nabaot b'chol dor vador, kiblu mehar Sinai. Rabbi Yitzchak said, what the prophets would receive in the future to prophesy in every generation, they received at Sinai. Shekain Moshe omer lahem liYisrael, as Moses told Israel, Ki et asher yeshno po imanu omed hayom lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, ve'et asher einenu po imanu hayom. But both those who are standing here with us this day before Adonai our God, and with those who are not with us this day. This phrase is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, one of those passages in which God reaffirms the covenant with the Israelites. And here in this passage from Deuteronomy, Moses reminds the Israelites that the covenant includes those who are standing here with us this day, as well as those who are not with us this day. But look at what the rabbis do with this verse. Hayom omed hayom ein ketiv kan, ella hayom hayom. The verse does not say those who are not standing here with us this day, rather those who are not with us this day. So whom is the second phrase referring to? The people who are not with us this day. Line 6. Elu haneshamot ha'atidot lehitbaraot. These are the souls that will one day be created. She'ein bahem mamash, shelo ne'emra bahem amidah. And because there is not yet any substance in them. They're not born yet. They haven't come into the world in physical form yet. Because there is not any substance in them, the word standing is not used in regard to them. Sha'af al pi shelo hayu ba'ota sha'a, kol echad ve'echad kibel et shalo. Although they did not yet exist, still each one received his share of the divine revelation. V'lo kol hanevi'im bilvad kiblu misinai nevuatan. Not only did the prophets receive their prophecy from Sinai. So Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, for example, prophets who lived centuries after Moses and this generation of Israelites, were also at Mount Sinai, not in physical form, but in some non-physical form. And there, centuries before their own lives, they were at Mount Sinai receiving the Torah. Line 8. V'lo kol hanevi'im bilvad kiblu misinai nevuatan. Not only did all the prophets receive their prophecy from Sinai, ella af hachachamim haomdim bechol dor vador. Kol echad ve'echad kibel et shelo misinai. But also each of the sages that arose in every generation received his share of the divine revelation from Sinai. So who was at Mount Sinai? Who received the commandments at Mount Sinai? Yes, the Israelites who were there then, that generation of Israelites who had followed Moses from Egypt and enslavement to freedom and to Mount Sinai. But it was not only the prophets, it was not only Isaiah and Jeremiah and the others, but also the sages. So Rabbi Akiva was there, and Hillel and Shammai were there, and Rav and Shmuel were there, and Rabbi Meir and his wife Bruria were there. All of the sages, all of the scholars who would interpret Judaism in the centuries following they too were at Mount Sinai. And I think this midrash is also telling us that we were there. You and I were at Mount Sinai. Even though our physical lives began thousands of years after Har Sinai, nevertheless, in some midrashic sense, you and I were there as well. I find this midrash to be so meaningful because it gives me the opportunity, at least in my imagination, to be there more than 3,000 years ago, to be there with my fellow Israelites. Gives me the opportunity to say to God, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh, all that God says, we will obey. I love this midrash because it puts you and me at Har Sinai. Text number 4. So what was it that was revealed at Mount Sinai? Was it just the words of the first part of Exodus chapter 20? Let's see how the rabbis answer this question. B'sha'ah shenigla HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Sinai litain Torah liYisrael. When God revealed God's self at Sinai to give the Torah to Israel, Amra LaMoshe al HaSeder. God communicated it to Moses in order. Mikra, the biblical text itself, Umishnah, the commentary on the Bible that was compiled in the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah that was compiled around the 6th century, the Agadah, and Agadah, that body of what we also call Midrash, of rabbinic legend. All of that was given at Mount Sinai as well. All of Judaism, in a sense, was revealed at Mount Sinai. Not just the Torah shebichtav, not just the written Torah, again, the words of Exodus chapter 20, but the oral Torah as well, the interpretations, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and Aggadic literature. Shene'emar, as the beginning of chapter 20 tells us, Vaidaber Elohim et kol hadvarim ha'eleh. God spoke all of these words. Line 4. Afilu ma shehatalmid shoel larav, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe ba'ota sha'ah. Even the question that a future student would ask his teacher, God told Moses at that time. Me'achar shelamadah mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Amar lo limadah liYisrael. After he had learned it from God, after Moses had learned it to God, God told him to teach it to Israel. And according to this midrash, all that Israel learned, not just there at the time of Har Sinai, but in every century following, in every generation following, every question and presumably every answer that will be asked and answered between a student and teacher, all of that was revealed at Mount Sinai as well. And so, for example, when we study Talmud and we see on so many pages of the Talmud long and sometimes very complicated discussions of the law, and in most cases finally coming to a conclusion, Rabbi A says this, Rabbi B says that, Rabbi C says something else, the law follows Rabbi A or Rabbi B or Rabbi C. That's the Talmudic methodology. Well, according to this midrash, God revealed to Moses all that we would subsequently read on every page of the Talmud. So every generation of rabbis, not just Rabbi Akiva in his time, not just Moses Maimonides in his time, but in contemporary times as well, the questions and the answers that are asked of rabbis and answered by rabbis, all of that was revealed to Moses. And so we have been discovering generation after generation, layer after layer, interpretations of God's will that God revealed to Moses way back at Mount Sinai. But text number 5 presents a different view of what was revealed to Moses. It begins with a discussion between God and Moses, up in heaven after Moses' death. Amar lo, God said to Moses, Adam echad yesh she'atid lihyot b'sof kama dorot, there will arise a man at the end of many generations, the Akiva ben Yosef Shemo. Akiva ben Yosef is his name. She'atid lidrosh al kol kots v'kots tilin shel halachot. This man, Akiva ben Yosef, will expound upon each tip heaps and heaps of laws. The rabbis are referring to the little three-pronged coronets or crowns or tips at the top of certain letters in the Torah text. By convention, certain letters in Torah calligraphy have these decorative flags or tips or crowns. And God is telling Moses that there is going to be somebody who is so brilliant, this is Rabbi Akiva that God is telling Moses about, that he will be able to derive interpretations not only of the words of Torah, not only of the letters of Torah, but even the little crowns on some of the letters. That's how brilliant Rabbi Akiva is going to be. Well, line 2. Amar lefanav, ribono shel olam harehu li. Master of the universe, Moses says to God, permit me to see him. I got to see this guy. If he's as brilliant as you say he is, I've got to see him. Line 3, Amar lo chazor la'achorecha. God said to him, turn around. And suddenly, line 4, halach v'yashav b'sof shmona shurot. Moses found himself in the academy of Rabbi Akiva. Again, this is centuries after Moses. And he sat down behind 8 rows of students. In the classical rabbinic academies, the most advanced students sat up front, closest to the teacher, and then each row contained students of lesser and lesser attainment. And so Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows. You could say that he was sitting among the beginner students. If you wanted to be insulting, you could say he was among the inferior students. And evidently he was inferior, because the Midrash goes on, he sat behind 8 rows, v'lo haya yodea mahen omrim, and he could not understand what they were saying. Tashash kocho, he was upset. Remember, we call Moses Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, or Moses our rabbi. And here Moses has been transported to the rabbinic academy of Rabbi Akiva, the most brilliant rabbi of his time, one of the most brilliant rabbis of all time, and Moses is completely flummoxed. Whatever it is that Rabbi Akiva is teaching, Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, cannot understand. And he is terribly upset. Line 5. Kivan shehigia ledavar echad. But when they came to a certain subject, Amru lo talmidav, and the students said to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi minayin lach? They said, Rabbi, from where do you know this? In other words, the students are asking Rabbi Akiva for the derivation of the law that he is teaching. And remember, whatever it is that he is teaching, and interestingly, the Midrash doesn't say what it was that he was teaching specifically, but whatever it was, poor Moses, sitting back in the 8th row, couldn't understand it, and he was upset. But then when Rabbi Akiva was asked, from where do you derive this law? Look at line 6. Amar lahen halacha leMoshe miSinai. He replied, it is a law given to Moses at Sinai. And finally, nit yashava da'ato, Moses was comforted. First, Moses was terribly upset that he couldn't even understand the point that Rabbi Akiva was making. But then he was reassured, he was comforted when Rabbi Akiva explained to his students that the point that he was making was derived from Moses at Sinai. It's not that the specific point of law had been revealed to Moses. but rather the rules of interpretation that one day would lead Rabbi Akiva to this particular point of law. Those rules of interpretation were given by God to Moses, and Moses passed those rules of interpretation on to the Israelites, and they passed these rules on generation after generation to their descendants. And so now, centuries later, the point that Rabbi Akiva is making, he derived using the rules of interpretation that came from Moses. Well, actually, that came from God through Moses. And so the interpretation that Rabbi Akiva came up with was valid, was rooted at Mount Sinai, because the rules of interpretation came from Sinai, came from God at Mount Sinai. And so any valid interpretation, not only the ones that Rabbi Akiva came up with, but the ones that previous rabbis and, of course, subsequent rabbis would come to, these interpretations, if they're rooted in the Mosaic rules of interpretation, the classical Jewish rules of interpretation, then these subsequent interpretations are also rooted in Sinai, which means that not only Rabbi Akiva's interpretations are rooted in Sinai, and not only Moses Maimonides' interpretations in the 12th century are rooted in Sinai, and not only Rabbi Yosef Karo's interpretations in the Shulchan Aruch and his Code of Jewish Law, which he compiled in the 16th century, are rooted in Sinai, but the halachic literature of today, the rabbinic literature of today, contains interpretations which also are rooted in Sinai. Our rabbinic interpretations of the 21st century are also rooted in Sinai. And so the enterprise of halakha, the enterprise of Jewish law, of figuring out what Jewish law says about this situation, about that question, and so on, that enterprise began with God and Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai. And as we continue this tradition of interpretation, we are continuing the process that began at Mount Sinai. Before we continue with text number 6, I want to tell you about a movie that I saw just the other day. I actually had seen this movie, I think when I was a teenager, and it stayed with me all these years, and I happened to find it on Amazon. And since it's an old, obscure movie, I was able to rent it for $1.99. That's a pretty good deal. It's a 1950 movie called The Next Voice You Hear. A young James Whitmore stars in the movie. He plays the husband, and a young Hollywood actress named Nancy Davis plays his wife. 2 years or so after she made this movie, Nancy Davis married another Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan. And of course, we know Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan from another context. So in this movie, people are listening to the radio. Remember, this is a 1950s movie. Not all that many people had TVs by then. So watching TV was not central to American experience, but listening to the radio was central to the experience of people throughout the United States and throughout the world. And so in this movie, people are listening to the radio one night, and then suddenly it is announced, the next voice you hear is the voice of God. And God speaks to people through the radio. All over the world, people listening to their radios hear the voice of God. But the most amazing thing becomes apparent afterwards. People in America heard the voice speaking to them in English. People in France heard the voice speaking to them in French. People in Germany heard the voice speaking to them in German. In other words, each person heard the voice of God in his or her own language. You may want to rent the movie if you're so inclined. It's not a great movie, but it does have an intriguing theme. And that's our introduction to the next midrash. So now text number 6. What did the people hear at Sinai? Ve'omer v'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'kolot. It says in Exodus 20, and all the people perceived the thunderings. Line 2. Hakol ein ketiv kan ella hakolot. Note that it does not say the thunder, but the thunders or the thunderings. The word kolot is plural. So why did the Torah tell us that they heard the kolot, the plural sounds, the thunderings, rather than the thunder? Line 3, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, Haya hakol yotzei v'nechalak l'shivim kolot. God's voice, as it was uttered, split up into 70 voices. L'shivim lashon, in 70 languages. Kedei sheyishma'u kol ha'umot, so that all the nations should understand. Remember that the Torah tells us that it wasn't only the Israelites who left Egypt. There was an eruv rav, there was a mixed multitude, a group of other people, non-Israelites, who also came out of Egypt with the Israelites, and according to this legend, also stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. And so when God spoke, the Israelites, who presumably spoke Hebrew, heard God's voice in Hebrew. And the other nations that spoke other languages, they heard God's voice in other languages. V'chol umah v'umah shoma'at kol bilshon ha'umah. And each nation heard the voice in their own vernacular, v'nafshotehen yotzaot, and their souls departed. Remember that ancient belief that if you get too close to the gods, or in this case, too close to the God of Israel, it may prove to be fatal? Well, evidently that's what happened to the mixed multitude. According to this legend, every person heard the voice in their own languages, the Israelites in Hebrew, the non-Israelites in their own languages, but the non-Israelites died. As a result of hearing God's voice, they simply died. Aval Yisrael hayu shomein v'lo hayu nizukin. But Israel heard, but were not hurt. The Midrash goes on. Bo ur'ei he'ach kol yotzei etzel kol Yisrael. Come and see how the voice went forth to each Israelite. Kol echad ve'echad lefi kocho. Each one with a force proportioned to his own individual strength. Line 7. Hazakenim lefi kochan. The old according to their strength. Habachurim lefi kochan, the young according to their strength. V'haketanim lefi kochan, and the children according to their strength. V'hayonakim lefi kochan, and the babies according to their strength. V'hanashim lefi kochan, and the women according to their strength. Line 8. V'af Moshe lefi kocho, even Moses according to his strength. Shene'emar Moshe yidaber v'halim ya'anenu v'kol. As it is said, Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. V'kol shahaya yachol l'sovlo. That is, with a voice that he could endure. And so each of the Israelites received the divine revelation in a slightly different form. Adults heard the words in a way that adults could understand. Youths heard it in a way that youths could understand. Children heard it in a way that was understandable to children, and even infants heard it in a way that was understandable to infants. God spoke, and each of us heard the words in a slightly different way. The Midrash continues on line 9, V'chein hu omer kol Adonai ba koach. As it is said in Psalm 29, the voice of Adonai is with power. B'chocho lo ne'emar, ela b'koach. Not with his power, with God's power, but with power. Line 12, kechocho shel kol echad ve'echad. That is, with the power of each individual. V'af nashim ubarot lefi kochan, even to pregnant women according to their strength. Heve omer kol echad ve'echad lefi kocho. Thus to each person it was according to his or her strength. Each of us heard the revelation slightly differently. Or to put that insight in our contemporary experience, each of us still can hear Torah differently. Each of us still can hear Torah in our own unique way. Our final midrash, text number 7, which I entitled The Cosmic Silence. Amar Rabbi Abahu b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kishenatan HaKadosh Baruch Hu et HaTorah, when God gave the Torah, tzipor lo tzavach, no bird twittered, of lo parach, no fowl flew, shor lo ga'ah, no ox lowed, ofanim lo afu, none of the ofanim, the flying angels in heaven, stirred a wing. Seraphim lo amru kadosh kadosh. The seraphim, the fiery angels, did not say kadosh 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 Adonai Tzevaot, etc. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. You may recognize that from the Kedusha. You may recognize that from our prayer books, but it comes originally from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah describes the angels praising God with these beautiful words, kadosh, kadosh, kadosh Adonai Tzevaot. Holy, holy, holy is Adonai Tzevaot, Molochol haaretz kevodo. The world is full with God's glory. But at this moment at Har Sinai, even the angels in heaven were silenced. Hayam lo nizdazea, the sea did not roar. Line 9, Habriot lo dabru, the creatures did not speak. The world was entirely silent. Ella ha'olam shotek umacharish. The world was hushed into breathless silence. V'yatsa hakol, and the voice went forth. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am Adonai, your God. Now you and I know silence, but I want to do a little experiment with you. I want to sit silently with you for a few seconds. What did you hear in these last few seconds? You might have heard a little bit of sound emanating from your computer or your TV. You might have heard the sound of the heating system blowing air through the room. You might have heard the sounds from outside. When we're sitting inside or when we're walking around outside, we're never in complete silence. Nature provides sounds. And yet, according to this midrash, the usual sounds of the world, both in this world and up in heaven, all of the sounds of the world were completely silenced. Not one bird twittered, not one fowl flew. The Ophanim and the Seraphim were silent up in heaven. The sea did not roar. None of the creatures spoke. And from the context of that absolute silence, that cosmic silence, God's voice came through. On one level, this midrash is trying to convey to us a sense of the absolute mysteriousness of the moment of Har Sinai, the absolute mystery of Har Sinai. From that beautiful silence emerged the voice of God. But I want to share with you something from the pen of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Let's scroll down to the footnotes, and footnote 26 tells us, here's a passage from Heschel's great book, God in Search of Man. The Bible has shattered man's illusion of being alone. Sinai broke the cosmic silence that thickens our blood with despair. At first glance, the Midrash seemed to be painting a picture of what I described a moment ago as a beautiful silence. But Heschel is thinking for a moment of a different kind of silence, a silent universe in which God does not speak, in which God does not tell us, love your neighbor as yourself, in which God does not tell us, take care of the needy, in which God does not tell us, observe the Shabbat. The notion of a world that is so silent, in which the voice of God is not perceived by humanity, that thickens our blood with despair. So for Heschel, this silence is not a beautiful thing. This silence is a horrifying thing, because the notion of a world without God's voice is a horrifying thought. And so in contrast to the silence that thickens our blood with despair, God speaks from Sinai. God spoke to us from Sinai thousands of years ago, and God continues to speak to us if only we're able to hear God. These are only a few of many, many midrashim that enhance the story of Har Sinai, that provide different levels of interpretation, and that teach us so many important lessons about Har Sinai, about God's revelation, and about the challenge to continue to hear God in our own lives. Shabbat Shalom.